Hey heroes, and welcome to another time-twisting episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an amount of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. In 1962, high school student Peter Parker was bitten by a radioactive spider, endowing him with superhuman abilities, and thus became the masked crime fighter, the Amazing Spider-Man. In 2014, this event was referenced as having happened 13 years prior, rather than the 52 years that had actually passed. In other words, the origin of Spider-Man had shifted forward in time to somewhere around the year 2001. This is what's referred to as the Sliding Timescale, and it's what we're going to be exploring today. On a surface level, the concept is relatively simple. Generally speaking, each new story takes place contemporarily with the year in which it was released. Of course, there are obvious exceptions, with tales taking place either in the past or alternate timelines, but that's not really what we're talking about here. To use an example from popular culture, one could compare it to something like The Simpsons. Despite dozens of seasons spanning as many years, the characters never actually age, because time doesn't seem to really pass, despite the fact that each episode takes place in the year in which it was released. Similar to the Marvel Universe, this leads to inconsistencies in the timeline whenever flashbacks are involved. Now, with something like The Simpsons, it's not something the audience is supposed to take terribly seriously, but the comparison stands. The difference, of course, is that in the Marvel Universe, characters have aged, and time does seem to move forward, albeit at a slower rate than actually passes for the reader. Here's one way to think about it. Let's say you have a monthly comic series. Now let's say the first 6 issues form a story arc telling a character's origin, which takes place over the course of a single month. Maybe a 7th issue takes place a week later, then there's a 3-issue story arc taking place over the course of a single day, then 2 more issues which each take place in the same week. Now, to be clear, I just made those numbers up as an example, but you can see how in a year's worth of monthly comics you can easily have a scenario in which less than 2 months pass in the actual story. And so to get back to the example we started with, it's pretty easy to see how we could have 52 years of publication with around 13 years actually passing in continuity. Generally speaking, the events which get pulled forward in time are those related to the heroes and villains of the Marvel Age, which officially started with the public debut of the Fantastic Four in 1961, and has also been referred to as the Modern Era and the Age of Heroes. Thus, the timeline of events in their book and other Marvel Age titles like the Avengers and the X-Men are perpetually tied to the present date, whatever that happens to be. Conversely, books published before this time generally remain set in the year they were originally published. For example, the original Human Torch, Jim Hammond, made his debut in 1939, and this remains canon regardless of how far forward the Marvel Age shifts. The same is true for Captain America and the multitude of characters who made their debut either during or shortly after the Second World War. Of course, when Captain America returned in the Marvel Age, it was explained that through a quirk of fate, he'd been frozen at the end of the war and hadn't aged in the years that he'd been gone. And so for him, as the Sliding Timescale pulls the Marvel Age further forward, his original adventures remain in the 1940s, while the amount of time that he spent frozen in suspended animation increases. For other World War II era characters who later returned in the Marvel Age, like the Human Torch and Namor the Submariner, there are often similar circumstances in which the individual in question disappeared or otherwise dropped from the public eye for an amount of time, and it's that amount of time that increases as the Marvel Age slides forward. Now, there are exceptions to this, like Patsy Walker, who debuted as a teenage character in 1944, but eventually became the superhero Hellcat in the mid-1970s. Now, within the canon of the Marvel Universe, those original Patsy Walker stories are actually representative of fictionalized tales written by Patsy's mother, but the point remains that despite being depicted in some form before the Marvel Age, Walker's teenage years do indeed shift forward with the sliding timescale. So now let's ask the question, how much time has actually passed in the Marvel Age? While there have now been over 60 years of published stories since the debut of the Fantastic Four in canon, it's only been around 15 years since then. Initially, this was a non-issue and things in the Marvel Universe moved at roughly the same rate as their publication date. One of the more obvious examples of this is Peter Parker being around 15 years old in 1962 and graduating from high school several years later in 1965. 20 years after that, there was an article in David Anthony Kraft's Comic Interview magazine in which writer and artist John Byrne and editor Jim Salicrup discussed, among other things, how long the Fantastic Four existed in canon. Here they revealed that by the time of the book's 20th anniversary in 1981, Byrne had started planting the idea that it had only been 7 years since the origin of the Fantastic Four. And so while Johnny was 16 in the book's early years, in the 1980s he was around 23. Jumping forward another 20 years, a 2005 handbook focusing on alternate universes indicates that the Marvel Age of Heroes at that point spanned anywhere between 10 to 15 years in canon. This is also noteworthy because, as far as I'm aware, this book is the first published use of the phrase sliding timescale. Only 3 years later, another handbook gave a more specific number, noting that as of 2008, the origin of the Fantastic Four had occurred approximately 13 years prior. Furthermore, it gave the rule of thumb that at that point one could assume that each year that passed within the canon of the Marvel Universe correlated roughly to 4 or 5 years of published books. It does note that there are aberrations within that framework, like Peter Parker's high school years, which we referenced earlier. Also, it seems that the idea of converting publication time to in-universe time is no longer applicable, and we've kind of hit something of a Simpsons-style standstill. In January of this year, 2025, Marvel editor Tom Brevoort responded to a question about this, clarifying that the broad belief for the past decade or two has been that about 15 years had passed since the origin of the Fantastic Four. Now, this all leads me to wonder if we can map out a rough estimate of how time has passed in the Marvel Age using what we know as a benchmark, but unfortunately it doesn't quite work out like that. Sure, originally there was about 7 years that passed in universe between 1961 and 1981, then there was about 15 years of time between 1961 and 2015, however there was also roughly 15 years between 1961 and 2025. Now, at first glance, one might assume that this means that every story published between 2015 and 2025 takes place within the span of a single year, but that's just not true. In fact, because of events that take place within the story, we know that the 15th issue of Ryan North's Fantastic Four run takes place at least a full solar year after the end of the previous volume. So what does this mean, and how does it make any sense? The answer is time compression. In other words, now, in 2025, it's been roughly 15 years since the debut of the Fantastic Four. This means necessarily that the stories which originally took place in 2015 have not only slid forward in time, but the amount of time between those stories and the start of the Marvel Age has been compressed to less than 15 years. Logically, the same would likely hold true for the supposed 7 years of continuity between 1961 and 1981, but who knows? Now, if that sounds unnecessarily complicated, you're not really supposed to think this hard about it. Generally, readers will want to simply roll with the idea that in modern continuity, the Fantastic Four and other contemporary superheroes have been active for somewhere around 15 years, and that all of their adventures have occurred in some nebulous chronology within that time frame. However, this all does lead us to one of the most peculiar aspects of the Marvel Universe. The past changes. Some changes are obvious, like how the Fantastic Four's initial spaceflight, originally taking place in 1961, was an attempt to beat the Soviets in the ongoing space race. By 2019, this event had been pulled forward to the early 2000s, and thus it was instead an attempt to be the first to master faster-than-light travel. Some changes are a bit more subtle. For example, in 2006, journalist Sally Floyd asked Captain America in an interview if he even knew what MySpace was, in an attempt to prove that he was outdated. In 2017, when reflecting on this interview, Floyd recalled asking if he knew what Twitter was. Some have theorized that the source of this temporal sliding and compression is a being with reality warping abilities, with some readers specifically pointing at Franklin Richards, the son of Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Woman. While one could argue that the time scale first began sliding roughly around the time of his birth in 1968, this idea is purely speculative on the part of fans and should be regarded as such. Another potential culprit is a man named Leonid, who ascended to something resembling godhood by a device called the Human Machine. Now, his story is a complicated one and is deeply interwoven with the Brotherhood of the S.H.I.E.L.D, a secret organization that dates back to ancient Egypt and has counted among its members historical figures like Leonardo da Vinci, Galileo, and Sir Isaac Newton. In the past millennia, a number of their exploits also involved Michelangelo Buonarroti, the famed Italian artist who evidently achieved some form of apotheosis and ascended into a state in which he ceased to exist as a linear entity, becoming known as the Forever Man. In 1502, Michelangelo revealed this nature to Leonardo da Vinci, as well as the human machine. In 1625, Sir Isaac Newton traveled to Ashomia, a city populated by the ancient monstrous race known as Deviants. Created by the Celestials a million years ago, the Deviants shared common ancestry with humanity, but developed advanced technology far earlier and ruled much of the world before the Great Cataclysm circa 18,000 BC. Newton came to them seeking knowledge, but was captured and forced to mate with one of their own, Morda. 5 years later, in 1630, shortly after the birth of his hybrid son, Newton stole the information that he wanted and fled. Scripture that the Deviants considered sacred and had kept hidden for thousands of years. This caused an uproar among the Deviants who turned against Morda and attempted to kill both her and her newborn son. While Morda was cooked and eaten by her own compatriots, her son Leonid was saved by the Forever Man. The infant was brought to a place outside the normal flow of time, where he was raised by the Night Machine, aka Nikola Tesla, and a luminescent bird woman. In 1953, Leonid was recruited into the Brotherhood of the S.H.I.E.L.D, which was still under the control of his biological father, although neither man knew of their blood connection at the time. Then, in 1956, the long-missing Leonardo da Vinci returned and challenged Newton's leadership of the Brotherhood. With each man presenting differing philosophies regarding mankind's control over its own destiny, or lack thereof, this resulted in a violent schism in the Brotherhood that lasted several years, with Leonid caught in the middle. He ultimately sided with Da Vinci's more optimistic ideals, but Newton fled a century into the future, and the conflict continued across 3 distinct possible versions of the year 2060 simultaneously. In the end, the 3 Leonids from each future timeline entered Michelangelo's human machine, coalescing and evolving into a single cosmic entity. In this state, he collapsed time itself into a single forever moment, allowing Newton to see the universe as only gods normally could, and effectively eliminating the divide between determinism and free will. The Forever Man described this as a new temporal state in which time would loop around upon itself, rewriting reality to form a universal truth instead of a constant one. A unified, evolving history. And of course, this all happened in 1960, just before the Fantastic Four's historic spaceflight and the initial inception of the Marvel Age, making it a likely explanation for the variable nature of the timeline from that point onwards. Naturally, very few beings within the universe itself are capable of perceiving the flow of time as it truly is. Occasionally there have been those that have glimpsed the true nature of reality, seeing that the past is not set in stone, but instead fluid and shifting. However, mortal minds are generally unable or unwilling to accept this. As one of those who actually can comprehend things as they are, Galactus has described the nature of spacetime as thus. The present, as we know it, is a moment that travels along a stream of events from the past into the future. Each event that it passes has a certain weight to it, with some greater than others. However, certain rare events, like the formation of the Fantastic Four and the dawn of the Marvel Age, are unique in that they have a peculiar gravity to them. These special events are thus caught by the present as it passes by them, and dragged along with it into the future. From the perspective of the present, they remain in the past but stay just a handful of years behind. Furthermore, this phenomenon sends ripples backwards in time, causing the past behind these events to reorient and reform into something new. Or as the Forever Man put it, an evolving history. Now, one might wonder how, if events like this are not the norm, how is it that so many of them happened around the same time? How do we have an entire generation of heroes emerging in rapid succession, each one producing enough temporal gravity to be dragged along into the future with their contemporaries? For this, we can point the blame at a group of Beyonders called the Omega Council. We've talked about the Beyonders before, so we won't get into detail here, but the short version is that they are a race of nigh omnipotent beings who are older than the current incarnation of the multiverse, and several that preceded it. Using a machine called the Concordance Engine, the Omega Council allowed the Prime Marvel Universe, Earth 616, to serve as an anchor for the unlikely. Essentially, this device scanned a myriad of potential realities for miracles and quirks of fate, binding them all to a single place and time. In other words, while implausible accidents that resulted in the origins of the likes of the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, the Incredible Hulk, and many others might have occurred somewhere in the vastness of the Omniverse, the Omega Council ensured that all of these happened on Earth 616 in the early 1960s. Thus, the dawn of the Marvel Age, which resulted not only in one universe of heroes, but an entire multiverse of possibilities branching out from it. Combining this surge of events, each with their own temporal gravity, with a reality in which the timeline is capable of rewriting itself, and we have a sliding timescale, in which an entire generation of heroes is continually pulled along into the future. Interestingly, due to the fluid nature of this timeline, there are even instances of past events changing, but then changing back to more closely resemble their original versions. For an easy example, in 1999, a book called Spider-Man Chapter 1 retold the origin and early years of the wall-crawling hero, and while the story was largely similar, there were some noticeable differences. Perhaps the most obvious of which is that in this version of events, the accidents which created Spider-Man and Dr. Octopus happened in the same place at the same time, with Peter Parker being caught in the explosion that fused Otto Octavius with his mechanical arms, shortly before being bitten by a spider that had been inadvertently irradiated by the experiment. And yes, this version of the story did take place in the Prime Marvel Universe, at least initially, as it was referenced in contemporary issues of The Amazing Spider-Man. However, the original canon was inevitably restored, and the Chapter 1 version of events was relegated to an alternate timeline. Another interesting example can be found with Nick Fury and his time as the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. A veteran of the Second World War and accomplished CIA agent, Fury was originally tapped to be head of the counterterrorism agency by Tony Stark in 1965. For decades, these events were dragged forward with the sliding timescale, and official handbooks continued to reference Tony Stark's involvement as late as 2010. Fury's status as a World War II hero remained, while his longevity was explained by his use of a compound called the Infinity Formula. However, by 2014, something changed, and Fury's induction into S.H.I.E.L.D. and the organization's early days slid back into the 1960s. I would then presume that in modern continuity, the Stark who welcomed Fury into the agency was Howard rather than Tony, but this is admittedly speculation on my part. Speaking of Tony Stark, his origin is another that has noticeably shifted and changed with the sliding timescale. Originally taking place in 1963, Stark was performing a weapons demonstration in Vietnam when he was badly injured by a shrapnel trap and captured by guerrilla forces led by the warlord Wang Chu. Of course, with help from the captive Chinese scientist Ho Yinsen, Stark was able to construct his very first suit of Iron Man armor that kept his heart beating and allowed him to escape. These circumstances remained consistent for years, although in the mid-1980s, around a decade after the end of the Vietnam War, things began to be more vague about the location, simply saying that it happened somewhere in Southeast Asia. However, by 2005, the location of his origin had shifted completely, instead taking place in Afghanistan in the Middle East. Of course, other details, like the involvement of Ho Yinsen, remained. Then, in 2019, his origin was shifted back to Southeast Asia, but this time to the nation of Sin Kong, a country which exists only within the Marvel multiverse. As such, his origin story now takes place during the Sin Kong conflict, an international affair that lasted many years and, unlike the Vietnam War, is pulled forward with the sliding timescale. Furthermore, other Marvel Age characters who have been depicted fighting in the Vietnam War, like Frank Castle, Jim Rhodes, or Flash Thompson, are now considered to have been involved in the Sin Kong conflict. This also applies to Reed Richards and Ben Grimm, who were shown to be World War II veterans in 1963. On a related note, there was a story that was published in 1968, but took place in 1944, which depicted Ben Grimm joining forces with Captain Savage and his Leatherneck Raiders. Naturally, this was originally meant to be the same Ben Grimm who became the Thing, but now is considered his grandfather for whom he was named. Now, the fluid and shifting nature of the time stream can also lead to some obvious contradictions. For example, Spider-Woman and Rocket Raccoon are two characters who have had multiple origin stories which seem to contradict one another, and yet it seems that both are considered canon on some level. I've already talked about those topics in their own videos, but they seem to serve as further proof that the past is not as set in stone as one might expect. Now, that is all the time I have for you this week, but there are plenty of other examples of things shifting or changing due to the sliding timescale, so I want you all to put your most notable examples in the comments. In the meantime, thank you all for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in these special thanks here, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel via monthly polls. That being said, if there's anything in particular that you want me to talk about, be sure to let me know in the comments. But as I said, that's all I've got for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!